They say we're entering a new Cold War. East versus West, America versus Russia and China, NATO versus BRICS. It's a world of hard choices, black or white, one side or the other. But in the middle of this chaos, there's one country that refuses to pick a side, a country that has somehow earned the respect of Washington, the trust of Moscow, and the attention of the entire developing world. That country, now as someone who's observed global power shifts for decades, from boardrooms in Shanghai to policy meetings in Brussels, I can tell you this much: India is playing a game few understand, and fewer still can afford to ignore. Because while Europe scrambles to cut off Russian gas, and while America tries to isolate Moscow with sanctions, India buys record amounts of Russian oil and still gets invited to the White House. While Russia sees the West as a threat, it sees India as a friend. And while the West sees Russia as the enemy, it sees India as a partner. This is not a coincidence. It's strategy, it's leverage, and it's rooted in a long, complex, and deliberate journey. In this video, I'll show you why India is the only country in the world today that can balance Russia and the West, not just economically or diplomatically, but ideologically. I'll take you through a century of history, through alliances and betrayals, through nuclear deals and border clashes, through war, trade, oil, tech, and the silent diplomacy that keeps the world from falling apart. Because the truth is, in a divided century, only a bridge can lead us forward, and India is becoming that bridge. Let's begin. To understand India's unique position today, we have to rewind, not 10 years or even 50, but back to the end of the Second World War. A world exhausted by fascism, desperate for order. Two new superpowers emerge, the United States and the Soviet Union, and with them, a global division, capitalism on one side, communism on the other. But India was freshly independent, a young nation born in pain, yet determined to stand on its own feet, and most importantly, unwilling to be anyone's pawn. Under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, India took a bold stand. It would not join either camp. Instead, it became the founding leader of the non-aligned movement, a group of nations that said no to Cold War bipolarity. Now, let's be honest, non-alignment was idealistic, but it was also strategic. Because while India didn't formally join the Soviet camp, it did lean east in several ways. The Soviet embrace. The Soviet Union supported India at crucial moments. It vetoed pro-Pakistan resolutions at the UN. It offered India cheap oil, weapons, and industrial support. And it didn't lecture India about democracy or human rights, which the West often did. In return, India gave the Soviets loyalty, though not obedience. During the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, while the US sent a naval fleet to support Pakistan, the Soviet Union backed India. That moment sealed a bond that still echoes today. By the late 1970s, India's military was largely Soviet-equipped. Its tanks, jets, and even naval platforms came from Moscow. And its political elite, many of whom studied in Moscow or admired socialist ideals, saw Russia not as a threat, but as a friend. The distant West. Meanwhile, India's relationship with the West, especially the United States, was complicated. During the Cold War, Washington saw India as too close to Moscow, and India saw the US as hypocritical, preaching democracy, but supporting dictators in Pakistan and elsewhere. Trade remained minimal. Military cooperation was non-existent, and the Indian public's perception of the West was lukewarm at best. But here's the twist. India never hated the West. It just didn't want to be lectured. What it wanted was respect and space to grow, a delicate balance. So through the Cold War, India walked a tightrope, leaning toward Moscow, but staying officially non-aligned, keeping trade routes open with the West, but relying on Eastern defense systems. It wasn't easy, but it worked. Then, in 1991, everything changed. The Soviet collapse and India's new dilemma. The fall of the Soviet Union shocked the world. For India, it was more than geopolitical. It was personal. A major trading partner vanished, military support froze, and India's own economy, heavily state-controlled and stagnant, began to crumble. It was a crisis, but also an opportunity. In 1991, India liberalized its economy, opened its doors to the West, began to privatize industries, attract investment, and modernize at scale. And suddenly, the game changed. India was no longer just a neutral player between two powers. It was becoming a power in its own right. Strategic memory. But here's the key point. India never forgot who stood by it when it was weak. Russia, not the US, armed India when the world looked away. That memory runs deep in Indian policymaking, even today. So even as India turned westward for trade, tech, and capital, it didn't abandon Moscow. It simply recalibrated, building parallel bridges, not burning old ones. That's the secret to India's modern foreign policy: multipolar friendship, singular loyalty to none, and strategic autonomy above all. The year was 1991. India was facing its worst economic crisis since independence. Foreign reserves were so low that the government had to airlift gold to London just to avoid default. Inflation was rising, imports were stalled, and the world, frankly, was watching to see whether India would collapse or adapt. India chose to adapt. Liberalization, opening the Indian mind and market. Under then Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, a quiet technocrat with an Oxford education and an iron will, India initiated a set of sweeping reforms. Tariffs were slashed. Licensing regimes were dismantled, foreign investment was invited, state-owned firms faced new competition. For the first time, the Indian economy was open to the world, and the world noticed. Western companies from Coca-Cola to IBM returned to India. Tech firms began outsourcing to Indian engineers. Multinationals opened headquarters in Mumbai, Bengaluru, and Hyderabad, and the Indian middle class began to rise. But here's the key: this economic pivot led to a diplomatic one. Because if India was going to trade with the West, it had to engage with the West, not just economically, but strategically. A cautious warming with the United States. For decades, India and the United States had been cold acquaintances at best. Their interests clashed during the Cold War. The US supported Pakistan militarily and diplomatically. India leaned on the Soviet Union and often criticized Western interventionism. But in the 1990s, the tone began to shift. President Bill Clinton visited India in 2000, the first major U.S. presidential visit in over 2 decades. He met schoolchildren, CEOs, and parliamentarians. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was symbolism, and the symbolism worked. Indian leaders began to see the United States not as a threat, but as a strategic opportunity. For America, the equation was simple. If China was rising, it needed a counterweight in Asia. And India, with its democracy, market potential, and population, was a natural fit. The nuclear paradox, from sanctions to partnership. But there was still one massive obstacle: India's nuclear weapons program. In 1998, India conducted a series of nuclear tests in Pokhran. It was a bold move, driven by regional security concerns, especially China and Pakistan. The West, led by the United States, responded with sanctions and condemnation. India was isolated again, but only briefly, because within a few years, those same countries realized something profound. India was not a rogue state. It wasn't North Korea. It had never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but had shown restraint, responsibility, and clarity in its nuclear doctrine. No first use. In 2005, something historic happened. U.S. President George W. Bush and Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh signed the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. For the first time, the United States agreed to recognize India's nuclear program and allow civilian nuclear trade. This deal changed everything. From sanctions to satellites, trust deepens. Once the nuclear taboo was broken, other doors opened. India began joint military exercises with the U.S., from naval drills in the Indian Ocean to counter-terrorism training in the Himalayas. It bought American aircraft and weapons. Indian students flooded U.S. universities. Indian tech CEOs began running Silicon Valley giants: Google, Microsoft, Adobe. But here's what makes this unique. India did not become an American ally. It became a partner on its own terms. It still bought oil from Iran, still maintained ties with Russia, still refused to join US-led military alliances like NATO or the AUKUS Pact. That's the Indian model: strategic cooperation without strategic dependence. Another critical factor in India's Western pivot was its global diaspora. By the 2000s, Indian-origin professionals, scientists, and entrepreneurs were embedded across the United States, Canada, the UK, and Australia. They weren't just workers, they were bridge builders, connecting cultures, economies, and politics. Indian Americans became doctors, engineers, investors, and eventually, lawmakers and diplomats. Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President, is of Indian descent.
Dozens of Indian origin leaders now sit in parliaments from the UK to New Zealand. This diaspora doesn't just shape foreign policy through lobbying or influence, it shapes perception. India is no longer the land of snake charmers or call centers, it is the land of CEOs, coders, and critical allies. The tech revolution, India as the digital partner of the West. During the 2010s, India transformed from a back-office IT hub to a digital powerhouse. Western big tech, Amazon, Google, Apple, Meta, began pouring billions into India's data and infrastructure ecosystem. India became the world's largest open internet democracy, unlike China, which closed its internet, and Russia, which censored it. Startups in India flourished. Fintech exploded. India built UPI, a digital payment system so efficient that even the French, Singaporeans, and Emiratis began adopting it. Once again, India wasn't following the Western model, it was creating its own, and exporting it westward. Strategic autonomy, India's diplomatic superpower. By the end of the 2010s, India had pulled off something almost impossible. Ronrai, strong ties with the United States, historic military and energy ties with Russia, growing trade with the EU and Japan, cultural influence across the Middle East and Africa, and a moral voice for the global South. No other country had managed this. China was isolated from the West. The US was distrusted in parts of Asia and the Middle East. Russia was sanctioned and cornered. But India? India was everywhere, without being owned by anyone. The West's view of India today. Today the West sees India not as a junior partner, but as an essential pillar in a multipolar world. US presidents, British prime ministers, French presidents, they all compete for face time with Indian leaders. They see India as the only large democracy that can stand up to China, as the only market big enough to rival China's economy, as the only country neutral enough to talk to both Moscow and Washington without losing either. That is not just influence, that is leverage, and India has it in abundance. Let me ask you something. In today's world of shifting alliances and broken treaties, what does it take for two countries to trust each other for more than 70 years? Not just cooperate, not just tolerate, but genuinely trust. For India and Russia, the answer lies not in ideology but in consistency. In a world that changes every decade, India and Russia have stayed remarkably steady in how they view each other, and to understand why this bond endures, even in the face of war, sanctions, and growing Western scrutiny, we have to go back to the roots of this unusual but powerful friendship. For much of the 20th century, India stood relatively alone on the world stage. It wasn't aligned with NATO, it wasn't in the communist bloc, it had conflicts with both China and Pakistan. It was a nuclear-capable post-colonial democracy trying to define its own path, without becoming anyone's satellite. In that uncertain terrain, the Soviet Union became India's most dependable ally. And that's not just diplomatic poetry, it's backed by hard numbers. By the late 1970s, over 70% of India's military hardware came from the USSR. Dozens of Indian scientists, engineers, and officers trained in Soviet academies. The USSR offered technology transfers, not just finished weapons, something the West rarely did. And during India's conflicts, especially the 1971 war with Pakistan, it was the Soviet veto at the UN that gave India breathing room. This wasn't charity, it was mutual alignment. The USSR needed a stable, non-Western partner in Asia. India needed defense, diplomacy, and development without being micromanaged. Thus began a relationship that would outlive the Soviet Empire itself. Defense, the cornerstone of the partnership. To this day, Russia remains India's largest defense supplier. And while India has diversified, buying from the US, Israel, France, Russia still accounts for over 40–50% of India's active defense inventory. Think about that. India flies Sukhoi and MiG fighter jets, operates Russian-made tanks, and fields submarines and missiles that are co-developed with Russian support. One example stands out, the BrahMos missile. This is a supersonic cruise missile, one of the fastest in the world, jointly developed by India and Russia. It can be launched from land, air, sea, or submarines, and it's now being exported to other countries, making India not just a buyer, but a defense exporter in its own right. That's not just a transaction, that's technology partnership, and it shows the depth of strategic trust between the two nations. Energy, sanctions for the world, discounts for India. Now let's talk oil. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West imposed sweeping sanctions. Russian oil was banned or price capped. European companies pulled out. Banking channels were cut. But India did not join the sanctions. Instead, it ramped up imports, big time. In fact, by mid-2023, Russia became India's top oil supplier, overtaking both Saudi Arabia and Iraq. At one point, more than 40% of India's crude oil imports were Russian, and what's more, it was being sold at heavily discounted rates. Now, critics in the West cried foul. They said India was financing Putin's war machine. They said a democracy should stand with the West. But India had a simple answer: energy security comes first. In a country where millions still struggle with poverty, keeping fuel prices low is not just economic, it's ethical. And to India's credit, it didn't abandon the West. It continued trading, attending G20 and hosting Western leaders, even as it bought oil from Russia. That's not betrayal, that's balance. Trade beyond oil and arms. While defense and oil are the most visible, Russia and India are expanding cooperation in other areas too. Nuclear energy. Russia has helped build Kudankulam nuclear power plant in Tamil Nadu, one of the largest in India. Space exploration. Roscosmos and ISRO have collaborated for years. Russian help was critical in earlier satellite launches. Education and culture. Thousands of Indian students still study in Russian medical and engineering universities. And then there's the rupee-ruble trade mechanism, a creative workaround to bypass the dollar and euro system affected by sanctions. It's not just about avoiding punishment, it's about building an alternative economic architecture. And why Russia trusts India but not everyone else? Now here's a critical question. Why does Russia trust India, even as it turns away from Europe and grows wary of China? There are several reasons. Tamil and inference. India doesn't lecture Russia on domestic policies, human rights or elections. That matters to a country like Russia, which resents moral posturing from the West. Strategic patience. India has stood by Russia during crises, including the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Ukraine war in 2022, without taking sides or burning bridges. China check. Russia knows India has deep concerns about China's rise, and that gives Moscow leverage. It can balance its ties with Beijing by staying close to New Delhi. That historical consistency earns trust. No alliance pressure. India doesn't pressure Russia to choose sides. It doesn't demand that Russia turn against China or the West. It simply maintains space for cooperation. That kind of diplomatic behavior is rare, and Russia recognizes it. Can this relationship survive the new Cold War? The short answer, yes, but it will evolve. India knows it cannot depend on Russia forever. It's investing in indigenous defense. It's buying from France, the US, and Israel. It's building energy corridors with the Gulf, Africa, and Southeast Asia. But India also knows this: no country gives up a friend like Russia, not when trust is so hard to come by in international politics. Even as India modernizes and expands westward, it will never fully abandon the Russian connection. That's the essence of India's geopolitical design: adaptation, not abandonment; diversification, not dependency; and autonomy above all. If you had told a US diplomat in the 1970s that India and the United States would one day become strategic partners, hosting military exercises together, sharing intelligence and co-developing high-tech defense systems, they would have laughed. Back then, India was seen as too socialist, too stubborn, too suspicious of Western intentions, and America, too close to Pakistan, too willing to lecture, and too unwilling to understand India's strategic concerns. But fast forward to today, and the story is radically different. Now US presidents call India a natural partner. Indian leaders address joint sessions of the US Congress, and both sides refer to the relationship as the most consequential partnership of the 21st century. How did this transformation happen? And more importantly, how has India managed to build this deep relationship without surrendering its independence? Let's break it down. From Cold War coldness to post-Cold War closeness. During the Cold War, Washington and New Delhi didn't see eye to eye. America viewed India as a Soviet sympathizer. India saw the US as an imperialist power backing Pakistan and meddling in Asia. The 1971 war over Bangladesh worsened tensions, with the US sending the USS Enterprise to the Bay of Bengal to intimidate India, while the Soviet Union sent nuclear submarines in response. Trust was minimal, military cooperation was non-existent, and public sentiment on both sides was frankly cold. But after 1991, with the Soviet Union gone and India liberalizing its economy, a window opened, and inside that window, two things happened. The US began to reassess India's potential as a counterweight to China. India began to see America as a gateway to global global influence and high technology. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was a meeting of interests. Karna, the nuclear breakthrough, trust earned not given. As we discussed in part 2, one of the most dramatic shifts occurred in the US-India civil nuclear deal. This deal was revolutionary. Why? Because it recognized India as a responsible nuclear power, even though it never signed the NPT, allowed nuclear commerce between the two nations, signaled a new level of trust from Washington. The US had never done this for any non-NPT nation. This was not just policy, it was a strategic exception made for India alone. Why? Because India had proven itself. It never proliferated nuclear weapons. It maintained a clear no-first-use doctrine, and most importantly, it acted responsibly, even when under pressure from neighbors. This deal was the beginning of what we now call the US-India Strategic Partnership. Military ties, from spectator to ally, without the label. Over the last 2 decades, military cooperation between the US and India has grown rapidly. Malabar naval exercises, India, the US, Japan, and now Australia regularly conduct drills together in the Indian Ocean. Yuddha Abhyas and Vajra Prahar, joint army exercises focused on counterinsurgency and mountain warfare. Logistics agreements, India and the US now share military bases, refueling rights and port access under the Lemoa and Kamkasa Pacts. Defense imports, India has bought Apache helicopters, P-8I maritime aircraft, Chinooks, M777 howitzers, and even American drones. In fact, by 2023, the US became one of India's top 3 defense suppliers. But here's what makes this relationship unique. India still refuses to become a formal ally. No military treaty, no NATO-style defense pact, no obligation to fight someone else's war. And yet, the trust and coordination between the two is deepening. That's not an alliance of necessity, it's an alignment of maturity. It's now in intelligence, cybersecurity, and advanced tech. The US shares satellite and surveillance data with India, especially during border tensions with China. The two countries have signed agreements on geospatial intelligence, BAK, that help Indian missiles and drones become more accurate. They collaborate on space research, cybersecurity, AI, and even semiconductors, with new chip plants backed by US companies being built in India. This isn't just about defense, it's about shaping the technological future together, and all of it without India joining a Western military alliance. Indo-Pacific Strategy, the real geopolitical pivot. Here's the geopolitical context behind this rapid deepening of ties. The United States is shifting its focus from Europe to Asia. It sees the Indo-Pacific, the vast region from the west coast of India to the eastern edge of Japan, as the future of global power. Militarily, economically, politically, America's old allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, are strong, but they're not big enough to counterbalance China alone. Only India, with its massive population, growing economy, and democratic system, has the scale and will to act as a regional balancer. That's why India is part of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, alongside the US, Japan, and Australia. And that's why Washington now prioritizes India in its strategic calculations. Soft power, diaspora, and democratic values. There's also something deeper, more human, that binds India and the West. It's not just about defense and deterrence, it's about shared values and people-to-people ties. Over 4 million Indian Americans live in the US, many of them highly educated, influential, and patriotic toward both nations. Indian students are the second largest group in American universities. Indian CEOs run major US companies, Google, Microsoft, Adobe, IBM. And India's democracy, though noisy and imperfect, resonates deeply in Western societies. In a world where democratic backsliding is real, India's ability to hold massive elections, maintain civilian control of the military, and sustain freedom of expression, even in messy form, sets it apart from authoritarian powers like China or Iran. The West may not always agree with Indian policies, but it respects its democratic roots. That respect goes a long way. Strategic independence, the heart of India's approach. Yet, and this is crucial, India has never allowed the West to dictate its terms. Even at the height of US-India cooperation, India refused to join Western sanctions on Russia. It continued to buy Iranian oil until pressured to stop. It rejected Western criticism of domestic reforms and internal matters. It made clear that India's foreign policy is not subcontracted to Washington or Brussels. That's why Western leaders treat India differently than other partners. They know India cannot be pushed, only persuaded. persuaded, and in a world full of fragile allies and unreliable partners, that consistency is ironically more valuable than blind obedience. Even when Western media and politicians criticize India over Kashmir, religious issues or press freedom, governments tread carefully, because they know something important: there is no plan B. India is the only country that can counterbalance China militarily in the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean, has the scale to become an alternative tech and manufacturing hub, has the democratic credentials to lead the global south, and has enough independence to act as a broker, not just a follower. If the US or Europe alienate India, they don't just lose a partner, they lose the only bridge to the rest of the non-Western world. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the world split, sharply and almost instantly. The West condemned, sanctions flew, embassies were shut down, assets frozen, Russian energy was blacklisted, and Moscow was branded a pariah. This was the biggest war in Europe since World War II, and the geopolitical pressure was intense. You were either with Ukraine and the West, or with Russia. There was no room for neutrality, no space for silence, no tolerance for balance, unless, of course, you were India. Choose the right side of history. From Washington to London, Brussels to Berlin, the pressure was real, and yet, India held firm. No sanctions, no public condemnation, no vote against Russia at the United Nations, no shift in oil strategy. Instead, India repeated a phrase that would define its foreign policy stance throughout the war: "We call for dialogue and diplomacy, not escalation." It was a statement designed for balance, not vague, but not provocative. Clear, yet careful. It was classic Indian diplomacy. India's UN position: neither yes nor no. Over several key votes in the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council, India chose abstention, not because it was indifferent, but because it refused to be pressured into picking sides in a war it didn't start, didn't provoke, and didn't benefit from. This neutrality frustrated Western commentators. Many called India a fence-sitter, some accused it of enabling Russia. Others warned it would lose moral standing. But behind closed doors, Western governments took a more nuanced view. They understood what most observers missed. India was doing what every great power eventually must, protecting its own national interests first. Buying oil from a sanctioned state. Let's talk about the elephant in the room: Russian oil. Before the war, India bought only 1–2% of its oil from Russia. By the end of 2023, that number had jumped to over 40%. India became Russia's top oil customer, paying in rupees, using intermediaries, and taking advantage of steep discounts. Was it opportunistic? Yes, but it was also strategic. India is a country of 1.4 billion people. It imports over 80% of its crude oil, and energy prices can make or break its economy, especially for the poor and working class. While European nations were paying twice as much for fuel due to their own Russian embargo, India was buying smart and shielding its economy from inflation. And here's the twist: Western countries knew this. They grumbled, they nudged, but they didn't punish, because the reality is, India is too important to isolate.
The Biden-Modi dynamic: respect without obedience. Throughout the war, the relationship between the US and India remained intact, even warm. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the White House multiple times. President Joe Biden hosted Modi for a state dinner, one of the highest honors. The two countries signed new defense and semiconductor deals during the conflict. India continued to participate in Quad, G20, and other Western-led strategic groupings. This is unprecedented. Any other country, say Turkey or Brazil, would have faced diplomatic cold shoulders for doing half of what India did, but not India. Because here's the uncomfortable truth for Western strategists: they need India more than India needs their approval. India is the only large democratic market that can rival China. It's a key defense player in the Indo-Pacific, and it's a swing vote in the emerging multipolar world order. So the US made peace with India's position, even if it wasn't happy about it. Modi's viral remark: "This is not an era of war." One moment from the Ukraine crisis stood out across global media. In a bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin, Indian PM Modi said, "This is not an era of war." It was direct but diplomatic, firm but respectful, and it went viral. Western leaders praised the comment. Ukrainian President Zelensky quoted it at the UN. And yet, Russia did not push back. That one sentence captured India's delicate balancing act, not just neutrality, but moral authority, not just friendship with Russia, but global leadership. In that moment, India positioned itself not as a bystander, but as a potential peace broker. India as a sanctions escape valve. Some accused India of helping Russia bypass sanctions. After all, oil was being refined in India and sold back to Europe. Russian banks accessed global finance through Indian intermediaries. Military spare parts and logistical support continued flowing. But again, India was not breaking laws. It was operating within the limits of existing systems, like the G7 oil price cap, while maximizing benefit for its citizens. Even Western analysts admitted India was acting smart, not subversive. This wasn't ideological. It was pragmatic. Why the global South supported India's position? India wasn't alone in refusing to sanction Russia. Many countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East followed the same path. But what made India different was this. It had credibility as a democracy. It had scale as an economy. And it had access to both Washington and Moscow. As a result, many developing nations began to rally around India as a diplomatic leader, someone who could speak for the global South while still engaging with the global North. India wasn't just balancing for itself. It was showing others how to do the same. Multipolar diplomacy, walking with all, leaning on none. This is the heart of India's global strategy during the Ukraine war and beyond. It maintains deep defense ties with Russia. It expands tech and military cooperation with the US. It explores energy deals with Iran and Saudi Arabia. It builds infrastructure projects with Japan and the EU. India's position is unique. Engage with everyone. Depend on no one. No other country of India's size and stature has managed this kind of balancing act. China can't do it. It's too tightly bound to Russia and distrusted by the West. Brazil can't do it. It lacks the military and tech heft. Europe can't do it. It's locked into NATO. And the US? It still expects allies, not equals. India, meanwhile, is shaping a new model, one where alignment is based on interest, not ideology. The outcome? India gained, not lost, from the crisis. Let's be blunt. India emerged stronger after the Ukraine war. It bought cheaper energy and saved billions. It deepened its global partnerships without compromise. It enhanced its reputation as a sovereign decision maker. It earned respect, even from those who disagreed with its position. And more importantly, it proved to the world that in a divided, polarized global system, a country can still act independently, morally, and strategically. That's not neutrality. That's geopolitical maturity. In a world fractured by sanctions, alliances, and suspicion, where the West sees itself as the guardian of order and Russia sees itself as the guardian of resistance, there is only one country trusted enough to speak to both sides without being dismissed by either. That country is India. It has the legacy of non-alignment, the memory of Soviet support, the partnership of Western democracies, the loyalty of the global South, and the confidence to say yes when it serves its interests and no when it doesn't. India does not flip sides. It builds bridges. It doesn't follow the West. It walks alongside it, while still shaking hands with the East. In this century of cold peace and hot proxy wars, India is not just balancing Russia and the West. It is teaching the world a new way to play power without becoming a pawn. And that is why India stands alone,